It all started with the festival. It always does in towns like ours. A place with roots so deep in folklore, the lines between history and legend blur like a fog creeping through the trees. Sleepy Hollow's shadow lingered long before the town turned it into an annual Halloween event. The locals didn't mind it, though. Tourism, after all, had a way of paying the bills. I never believed the stories. Not really. I mean, sure, they had their charm. The tale of the Headless Horseman, the cursed Hessian soldier searching for his head, chasing Ichabod Crane through the mist. It was all good fun, nothing more. That was until the night when it became real. The night started like any other. The streets were alive with the glow of orange lights, flickering jack-o'-lanterns, and the laughter of tourists. The autumn wind was sharp, biting through costumes as people milled about, admiring the elaborate scarecrow displays and listening to the town's reenactors spin their yarns about the horseman. I was standing with a group of friends near the old covered bridge, the place where the legend supposedly ended, when the air around us changed. One moment we were laughing, making fun of the festival's over-the-top theatrics. The next, everything felt wrong. There was a heaviness in the air, a pressure like the weight of 1,000 eyes watching from somewhere deep in the trees. The wind died down suddenly, leaving an unnatural silence in its wake, as if the world itself was holding its breath. That's when we heard it. The clatter of hooves in the distance. Slow at first, deliberate, like something was pacing just out of sight, waiting. "Must be one of the actors," someone in the group said, though the words came out weak, uncertain. None of us moved, our feet rooted to the spot as that sound grew louder, closer. The clop of hooves on cobblestone echoing through the stillness like a heartbeat. It was then that the first scream shattered the night. Blood-curdling, sharp, and so sudden that my breath caught in my throat. We turned toward the sound just past the line of trees. Through the dim light of the festival lanterns, I saw something moving, fast. A shadow on horseback, silhouetted against the dying light, galloping with an unnatural speed toward the center of town. But it was what came next that chilled my bones. A streak of red in the air, a spray of something dark, followed by another scream, shorter this time, strangled in its throat. The figure on the horse, its head was missing. The festival-goers hadn't noticed yet. They were too busy laughing, drinking cider, playing their part in the town's celebration. They didn't know the blood was real. But we knew. We saw it happen. We saw him. I heard someone behind me mutter a prayer, but it didn't help. The horseman, he was real and he was hunting. The reality of it hit me then like a slap to the face. The legends, the stories, they had somehow become true. Whether through some twisted ritual, a slip between worlds, or just plain evil luck, the Headless Horseman had been summoned to this town, and he wasn't here for fun and games. There was no time to think, only time to run. We turned and bolted toward the festival's main square, where the crowds were thick, unaware of the terror closing in. My heart pounded in my ears, and I could still hear those hooves behind us, closing the distance. Thundering. Inescapable. Another scream. This one closer. Then a thud, like something heavy dropping to the ground. I glanced back just for a second, and that's when I saw it. A head, rolling across the street, bouncing once, twice, and then landing in the gutter like a discarded pumpkin. My stomach lurched, and I forced myself to keep running, the taste of bile rising in my throat. I didn't look back again. We made it to the square, panting, breathless. But the horror wasn't over. Not yet. The horseman hadn't stopped. I could hear the thud of hooves, relentless, getting closer. But where could we go? How could we stop something that wasn't supposed to exist? The festival lights flickered above us, and then one by one they went out. The square was plunged into darkness, save for the dim glow of the moon hanging low in the sky. People around us started to notice that something was wrong. The laughter died, replaced by murmurs of confusion, then fear. Then came the galloping. Fast. Too fast. I saw him again, tearing through the square, cutting down anyone in his path. It was chaos. People screamed, pushing and shoving, trying to escape, but there was no escape. The horseman moved with a purpose, his sword raised high, glinting in the pale moonlight. And then he stopped. Right in front of me. I don't know why. I don't know how. But there he was, towering over me, his body still, his sword dripping with blood, his headless form looming like a dark monument to death itself. The ground beneath my feet felt cold. His horse snorted, steam rising from its nostrils like smoke from some infernal engine. He pointed at me with one gloved hand. My blood froze, and then he spoke. No mouth, no head, yet the voice, rasping, hollow, rumbled through the air like the sound of bones scraping together. "I'm not finished yet." The moment those words cut through the night, the ground seemed to fall away beneath me. My legs gave out, collapsing under a weight I hadn't known I was carrying until that very second. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The horseman, the real horseman, was staring at me with nothing but that empty space where his head should have been, as if he could see me, see straight into my soul. His horse stomped the ground, a sharp, deliberate motion that sent a shiver crawling up my spine. And then, just like that, he was gone. He wheeled around on his steed, disappearing into the shadows as though he was part of them. The sound of hooves faded into the distance, leaving only the screams and cries of the townsfolk behind. I scrambled to my feet, hands shaking so violently I couldn't even brush the dirt from my knees. My friends, what was left of them, stood frozen in place, eyes wide with shock. A girl, Tina, I think, whimpered something incomprehensible before turning and sprinting toward the nearest alley. The others followed her, as if that dark, narrow space could somehow protect them. I wasn't so sure. There was blood on the cobblestone. Dark streaks where the horseman had cut through the crowd like a reaper harvesting souls. Bodies lay crumpled, lifeless, heads twisted at grotesque angles. One of them, a guy I recognized from school, had his head gone, just gone. His neck was a jagged stump, and the sight of it twisted my insides in ways I can't describe. "Move! We've got to move!" someone yelled, shaking me from my trance. I didn't even know who it was anymore. Faces had blurred into something else, something meaningless. All I knew was that we had to get out of there, as far away as possible. We ran. The town had become a labyrinth of panicked screams and pounding footsteps. People trampled each other in the streets, their costumes and festival masks discarded in the frenzy. I could hear the distant wail of sirens, but even that was swallowed by the chaos. Nothing could help us. Not the police. Not the town. No one. We ducked into a side street, the buildings pressing in on us like they were trying to squeeze the life out of whatever small hope we had left. My chest ached, every breath a struggle, but I pushed on, my legs burning as we rounded corner after corner. But the hooves, they started again. Faint at first, distant, but unmistakable. That sound was burned into my mind now, the hollow, deliberate rhythm that signaled death was coming. Closer, closer. "Where the hell is he?" one of the guys in the group shouted, looking around wildly. "He was right behind us!" The answer came in the form of a wet, sickening thud. We all froze, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run, but my feet felt glued to the ground. Slowly, I turned to look behind us, back toward the alley we'd just come through. I didn't want to. I didn't want to see it, but I had to. The boy who had been with us, his name escaping me in the panic, was gone. In his place was a body, no head, slumped against the brick wall of the alley. Blood ran in rivers down the street, pooling at our feet. The horseman had taken him. Just like that. One moment he was there, the next he was just gone. "We can't stay here," another voice urged. It sounded hollow, far away, like I was underwater. Everything was muffled now, the panic and terror so thick it was hard to focus on anything but the sound of my heart hammering in my chest. We pushed forward again, but this time something changed. As we emerged from the alley, the street ahead of us was completely empty. Not a soul. No more festival goers, no police, no one. It was like the entire town had been wiped clean. The silence more deafening than the screams had been. "I don't get it," Tina whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of our feet. "Where did everyone go?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. I didn't know. I didn't care. I just wanted out of this nightmare. We were heading toward the covered bridge again, the same one where this had all started. It was stupid, I knew that, but there was nowhere else to go. The town's layout funneled us there like it was designed to. The bridge loomed ahead of us, its wooden frame barely visible in the dark, and I could feel the weight of it, the history pressing down on us. This was where the horseman had been defeated in the stories, where Ichabod Crane had made his last stand. But this wasn't a story. This was real, and there was no legend to save us. "Just get across," someone muttered, pushing us toward the entrance. "If we get across, we'll be safe." We didn't believe it. Not really. But it was the only hope we had left. The bridge was long. Too long. It stretched out in front of us, a tunnel of shadows and creaking wood. Every step echoed, bouncing back at us like mocking laughter. And then we heard it again. The hooves. Louder this time. Closer. He was coming. We broke into a sprint, our feet pounding against the planks as the sound of the horseman's approach filled the space behind us. I could hear his breath now, ragged and wet like a dying animal. I didn't dare look back, but Tina did. Her scream pierced the night, and when I glanced over my shoulder, she was gone. Just gone. A spray of blood hit the side of the bridge, and something hit the ground with a thud. I didn't stop running. I couldn't. The bridge stretched on forever. My lungs were burning, each breath like fire searing my chest, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't even blink, not with the horseman at our heels. His hooves beat against the wooden boards of the bridge like a war drum, pounding closer with every second. But I had no choice. If I stopped, I would die. I didn't want to die, not like that. The blood, the bodies, the ones we left behind. I tried not to think about them. Tina's scream still echoed in my ears, but it didn't matter. Nothing mattered anymore but getting away. And yet, as we ran, the horseman's shadow seemed to grow longer, stretching out in the moonlight, reaching for us. One of the guys, a kid from school I barely knew, was starting to lag behind. His breath came in ragged gasps, and his feet were stumbling, like the weight of everything was too much for him. I wanted to shout at him to pull him forward, but the words stuck in my throat. The sound of hooves grew louder, closer, and before I could react, the kid's head snapped back violently. I saw it happen in slow motion. The horseman's sword slicing clean through his neck like a blade through butter. Blood sprayed across the wooden boards, a thick dark mist, and his body crumpled to the ground, headless just like the others. I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The smell of blood filled the air, thick and metallic, but I forced it out of my mind. My vision tunneled, narrowing to the end of the bridge, where a sliver of light beckoned us forward. If we could just get there, if we could just cross that threshold, maybe, just maybe, we'd survive. There were only 3 of us left now. The others had fallen, their bodies lost to the horseman's relentless pursuit. But there was no time to mourn, no time to think, only run. We burst from the bridge and into the cold, crisp night air. For a brief, fleeting moment, I thought we'd made it. The moon hung high above us, casting long shadows across the deserted street, and the town stretched out before us, eerily silent. I turned to the others, my heart still hammering, my breath coming in shallow gasps. But the sound of hooves, it stopped. There was nothing but silence. The horseman was gone. We did it, one of the girls whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding in my ears. She was trembling, her face pale and streaked with blood, not her own, but from the others. He's gone, we're safe. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to cling to that small shred of hope, but something wasn't right. The silence was too deep, too unnatural. The town was empty, completely empty. No festival goers, no tourists, no one. What happened to everyone? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. I glanced around, my eyes scanning the darkened windows of the buildings that lined the street. It was like the town had been abandoned, like we'd stepped into some kind of alternate reality where nothing was as it seemed. The others were looking around too, their faces etched with confusion and fear. And then, from somewhere deep within the shadows, I heard it. Laughter. Not loud but soft, almost like a child's giggle. It echoed through the empty streets, bouncing off the brick walls of the buildings, and I felt my blood turn to ice. The others heard it too. They froze, their eyes wide, fear crawling over their features like a sickness. The giggling grew louder, more insistent, and then, from the corner of my eye, I saw something move. A figure. Small, hunched, darting between the shadows just at the edge of my vision. I turned, my heart hammering in my chest, and for a moment I saw it. A child, or at least something that looked like a child. Its skin was pale, almost translucent in the moonlight, its eyes wide and dark, glinting with something wrong, something inhuman. It smiled at me, its lips curling back to reveal rows of sharp, jagged teeth. I blinked, and it was gone. "Did you see that?" I whispered, my voice trembling, but the others didn't respond. They were looking at something else, something behind me. I turned slowly, my stomach churning with dread, and what I saw froze me in place. The bridge, the same bridge we'd just crossed. It was gone. Not just empty, but completely gone, as if it had never existed at all. The river beneath it flowed silently, unbroken by any structure. My mind struggled to make sense of it, to reconcile what I was seeing with what I knew to be true. We'd crossed that bridge. I knew we had. But now it was as if it had never been there in the first place. The girl beside me began to cry softly, her sobs cutting through the silence like broken glass. I wanted to comfort her, to tell her it was all going to be okay, but I didn't believe it. I couldn't. Suddenly, the air grew cold again, bone-chillingly cold. I could see my breath in the moonlight, little clouds of frost forming with every exhale. The ground beneath our feet trembled, a deep, rumbling vibration that seemed to come from the earth itself. And then, from the shadows ahead, the hooves started again, louder, faster. But this time, there were more. Not just one set of hooves, dozens, maybe hundreds. The sound filled the night, a deafening roar of galloping horses, of death on horseback, barreling toward us. I looked at the others, panic rising in my throat, and we all started running again. But this time there was no direction to run, no safe haven. The town had turned into a maze of empty streets and endless shadows, and the sound of hooves was everywhere, surrounding us. I rounded a corner, skidding to a halt as the others followed behind me, and that's when I saw it. The street ahead was blocked, not by buildings, not by cars, but by a sea of figures. Dark, headless figures on horseback, their swords raised, their horses snorting steam into the cold night air. They were waiting for us. And in the center of them, at the front of the pack, was the horseman. But this time he wasn't headless. In his hand, held high like a grotesque trophy, was Tina's head. And her eyes were still moving. Her lips curled into a twisted, horrifying smile. And then, in that voice, that deep, rasping voice, the horseman spoke once more. "You're next." The world around me spun in chaos. The horseman, surrounded by his army of headless riders, held Tina's head aloft, her dead eyes locked onto mine with that twisted, unnatural smile. My heart pounded in my chest, and everything inside me screamed to run. But where would we go? There was nowhere left to hide, nowhere safe. We were trapped, cornered like animals. The others had frozen behind me, paralyzed with terror. I could hear their panicked breaths, the shallow gasps of fear that matched my own. But something deep inside me wouldn't let me give up. There had to be a way out. There had to be. I forced myself to think. The horseman, he wasn't invincible. There was always something, some weakness hidden in the old stories. The legend of Sleepy Hollow was full of tricks and loopholes, but I needed to find the right one. What had they always said? How had Ichabod Crane escaped? My mind raced, sifting through the fragments of tales I'd heard as a child. In the stories, Ichabod had supposedly crossed the covered bridge, leaving the horseman trapped on the other side. The bridge was supposed to be a boundary between their world and ours, but the bridge was gone now. Or was it? I glanced behind me at the spot where the bridge had once stood. There was nothing there, just the dark, rushing river, mocking me with its emptiness. But then it hit me. The bridge wasn't just a physical barrier. It was symbolic, a marker between the living and the dead. If we couldn't cross the bridge, maybe we could bring it back. The horseman's army started to advance, their hooves thundering against the ground, shaking the earth beneath our feet. I didn't have much time. Turning to the others, I grabbed the nearest person's arm, pulling them close. "We need to find the boundary!" I shouted over the growing roar of hooves. "The place where the horseman can't cross. It's not about the bridge. It's about the boundary." Their eyes widened with confusion, but they didn't question me. We had no choice but to try. Anything was better than waiting to be slaughtered. I scanned the street, my mind racing. The town square. The old church. Every story about the Headless Horseman had one thing in common. He was a spirit trapped between two worlds, bound to the land by his curse, unable to step foot on consecrated ground. "The church!" I yelled, my voice barely audible over the clatter of hooves. "We need to get to the church!" Without another word, we took off running. The church was a few blocks away, an ancient structure that had stood in the town for as long as anyone could remember. If we could make it there, maybe, just maybe, we'd have a chance. The sound of the riders behind us was deafening now. I didn't dare look back. I could feel their presence, the cold, unnatural energy pushing at my back, urging me to run faster. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air, but I didn't stop. Finally, we reached the edge of the churchyard. The wrought iron gate stood open, and beyond it, the stone building loomed like a beacon of hope in the darkness. I could feel it, this place, this ground. It was sacred, consecrated. The horsemen couldn't follow us here. We stumbled through the gate, collapsing onto the grass as the last of the group made it inside. I turned just in time to see the horseman pull his steed to a halt at the gate, his sword raised high. But he didn't cross. He couldn't. The boundary had stopped him. For a moment everything was still. The riders hovered at the edge of the churchyard, their headless forms shrouded in mist, their horses snorting and stamping, frustrated but unable to move forward. The horseman stared at us, or at least I imagined he did, though his face was still hidden in shadows. We had done it. We had made it to safety. But there was one last thing we had to do. Standing up, my legs trembling beneath me, I took a step forward, my eyes locked on the horseman. He was holding Tina's head still, her lifeless face frozen in that grotesque smile. But I could see it now, the key to ending this nightmare. "Let her go," I said, my voice shaky but firm. The horseman tilted his head as if considering my words. And then, to my shock, he lowered his sword. Slowly, almost gently, he set Tina's head down on the ground at the edge of the churchyard. Her eyes closed as soon as her head touched the earth, and her body, what was left of it, seemed to shimmer in the moonlight before dissolving into the mist. The horseman raised his hand to his chest, where his own head should have been, and I understood. He didn't want to kill, not really. He wanted what had been taken from him, a chance to rest, to return to his grave whole once more. "I'll help you," I whispered, stepping closer to the edge of the churchyard. "I'll help you find peace." The horseman stood still, his body tense as if waiting. I closed my eyes, focusing on the old legends, the stories passed down through generations. If I could summon him, I could send him back. With a deep breath, I whispered the words I'd heard in one of those stories long ago. Words meant to return the dead to their graves, to lay restless spirits to rest. The air around me shifted, the wind picking up as the world seemed to hold its breath. And then slowly the horseman began to fade. One by one, his riders disappeared, dissolving into the mist like smoke on the wind. The sound of hooves faded into the night, replaced by the soft rustling of leaves in the trees. The horseman looked at me, if you could call it looking, and for a brief moment I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. And then, with a final flicker of moonlight, he was gone. The town was silent again. No more screams, no more terror. Just the soft hum of the night, peaceful and quiet. We were safe. Looked around at the others, their faces pale but alive. We had survived. Somehow, against all odds, we had made it through the night. I glanced back toward the spot where the horseman had stood, and though he was gone, the feeling remained. A sense of peace, of closure. We weren't haunted anymore. The nightmare was over. And as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, I knew one thing for certain: the horseman would never ride again.